People used to call me Miss Luanne at the docks. That wasn't my real name. It was just what the men shouted when I showed up at sunrise with my gloves and my coffee. "Morning, Miss Luanne," they'd say, teasing but kind. My name was Martha Reeve, and for 17 years I worked at the Port Haven Fish Market, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Tilapia, catfish, snapper, you name it, I've scaled it. It wasn't a glamorous job. By the end of every shift, my hands smelled like salt and iron. The cold seeped into my bones so deep it stayed through summer. But I did it for one reason: my daughter, Jessica. She was going to have a life that smelled of perfume, not of fish. I sold my wedding earrings to buy her first computer. I cleaned houses on Sundays so she could go to summer programs. Every blister on my hand felt like a small down payment on her future. If you've ever worked yourself raw just to give your child a better shot, you know what I mean when I say I thought it would all be worth it. But love doesn't always look beautiful in the mirror of ambition. When she hit high school, she started flinching at my hugs. If I picked her up from practice, she'd rush into the car before anyone saw me. Once, I brought fried catfish sandwiches to her team picnic. She refused to eat a bite. "Ma," she whispered, "people don't eat that stuff here." That was the first time I realized my love embarrassed her. She went off to college in Ohio on a scholarship and a few of my last paychecks. I remember the day we packed her things. She hugged me quick, like I was a memory she couldn't wait to forget. When she called me months later, it was never to ask how I was. It was always, "I need money for books," or "for rent." Once, she said she needed $5,000 for professional presentation. Later, I found out she used it for cosmetic surgery because, as she told her friends over the phone, "I can't build a brand looking like I crawled out of a fish freezer." I kept quiet. That's what mothers of my generation do. We endure. We don't explode. We erode. When she graduated, she sent me a copy of her senior essay, the one that helped her get into a business incubator. It described her childhood as shadowed by the smell of docks and despair. She called me a figure of labor, not of love. I read it 3 times, thinking I must have misunderstood. But words don't change their shape when they hurt. I folded the essay and tucked it away with my pay stubs. Proof, I guess, that even the cleanest hands can carry shame if someone teaches them to. You still with me? If you are, it means you understand what it's like to give everything and still be treated like a stain. So stay with me, because the way this story turns, you're going to want to see what quiet justice looks like. Jessica moved back to Ohio after her startup took off, a social app that connected young women in business. She called it Ambition Avenue. I never really understood what it did, but I knew it made her rich. When she bought a penthouse in Columbus, she said, "Mom, you should come for dinner. I want you to meet my investors." I thought maybe finally she wanted to be proud of me. So I drove 6 hours in my old truck, wearing my nicest dress, the one I kept pressed for church. The dinner table sparkled with crystal and pretense. As I walked in, she looked at me for half a second and said, "Oh, good, you're here. You can help in the kitchen." She handed me an apron. The investors laughed politely, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. When I hesitated, she leaned in close and hissed, "You're not even worth a dog, Mom. Either cook or get out of my sight." Her purebred golden retriever lay nearby, wearing a velvet bow tie on a silk cushion. And that was the moment I understood exactly where I stood. I left without a word. When the elevator doors closed, I saw my reflection in the mirrored wall. Hair flattened, eyes hollow. I looked less like a mother and more like a ghost that had finally realized it was dead. At dawn, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. He asked what had happened. I said only, "Enough." By the time the sun climbed over the courthouse, I had removed Jessica from my will. The house, my savings, the $1.3 million I'd quietly built over decades, all reassigned. As I signed, I thought, you can't buy class, but you can sell dignity cheap. And I was done selling. That was the first step toward freedom. You'd think that would be the end of it, wouldn't you? But humiliation has an encore. A month later, I saw her on TV, being honored at a gala for Women Who Inspire. When the host asked about her upbringing, she smiled and said, "I was the first in my family to know which fork to use." The crowd laughed. She didn't mention me. She didn't mention the fish market or the hands that bled to pay her tuition. Then Thanksgiving came. I visited her house mostly to see my grandkids. On the wall, there was a framed family photo, except I wasn't in it. Where I had stood, she had pasted a picture of her dog wearing a tuxedo. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said, "You just didn't match the decor, sweetie. We're doing neutrals now." If you've ever been erased by your own child, not physically, but in memory, then you know the pain I felt in that moment. It's the kind of ache that doesn't shout. It hums beneath your ribs until it becomes part of your heartbeat. But sometimes the thing they erase becomes the very thing the world remembers. Want to know how I turned that pain into power? Then don't go anywhere, because the next part is the reason this story is called True Life Stories. Every woman's life, when silence becomes betrayal, not to others, but to herself. Mine came on an ordinary Tuesday night. I was sitting in my small apartment folding laundry when Jessica's voice floated through the baby monitor I kept for the grandkids. She was on a call in the next room, bragging to one of her assistants. "My mother? She's just the maid who birthed me. I keep her around for pity. It looks good for fundraising." I froze, not because it surprised me, but because hearing it said out loud made it real in a way my heart couldn't pretend away anymore.
So I took out a small black recorder I kept in my drawer, the same kind we used years ago to document shipments at the dock. And this time, it recorded something heavier than fish counts. It recorded the death of denial. There's an old saying at the docks: if you treat a tide bad, it'll bring you back your own debris. The next morning, I drove 3 hours south to meet Marcus Gray, a man I'd once fed when he was a hungry boy sneaking around the piers. He'd grown into something remarkable, a state civil court judge. When I walked into his office, he stood up and smiled. "Miss Martha, I'd know that face anywhere." I handed him the recorder. "I need you to hear something," I said. He listened. By the time the tape ended, his jaw was set and his eyes had changed from kind to cold. "This," he said quietly, "isn't just cruel, it's evidence." Within a week, Jessica's words were quoted in headlines across the state. CEO calls her mother just the maid. Her sponsors vanished overnight. Advisory boards removed her name. Civic grants pulled their support. She was called to an ethics hearing and suspended from every leadership role she held. Her empire of perfection crumbled, not because I shouted, but because I whispered the truth. After everything unraveled, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. Justice is heavy, even when it's deserved. I went back to my lawyer and told him to finalize my plans. He asked where I wanted the $1.3 million to go, and I said, to someone who gave when she had nothing to spare. Her name was Violet Anders, my old neighbor who let me sleep in her attic when my roof caved in and refused to take a penny of rent. Violet used the inheritance to open a small training center called the Second Act Center, a place where women over 50 could learn new skills, find work, and be seen again. The first time I walked in, the air smelled like coffee and fresh paint. There were laughter lines in every corner and stories written on every face. They asked me to tell mine, and that's when I became Granny Fish. It started as a joke. One of the ladies said, "You smell like the ocean and truth," but it stuck. Now every Tuesday afternoon, I sit in a circle of women who once believed their best years were behind them, and we talk, we heal, we remember. Of course, Jessica didn't take her fall quietly. She filed a lawsuit claiming I was mentally unfit, said I'd been manipulated, said my memory was failing, but Marcus saw through it. The court ruled against her, calling her behavior a pattern of deceit and emotional toxicity. She lost the case, and with it, custody of her children. The world she built on denial collapsed in front of her, like a tower made of mirrors cracking under its own reflection. I didn't celebrate. I prayed for her. Because when a tree cuts off its own roots, it's already dying. Now I live in a small cottage beside the second act center. There's a wooden porch swing, and every evening the smell of salt from the docks still finds me, like an old friend who refuses to let me forget where I came from. The women here call me Granny Fish. The children bring me drawings of boats and hearts. And sometimes when they ask me how I stayed strong, I tell them dignity isn't given by children or applause. It's earned in the dark hours, in the cold, when no one is watching. If you're still listening right now, maybe you've carried that same kind of quiet strength. Maybe you've given everything for someone who forgot to say thank you. If that's you, then I want you to remember this. Your story still matters. And sometimes justice whispers in the voice of an old woman who's finally done staying silent. I never thought the world would know my name again, but it's not my name that matters. It's what it stands for. So if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or maybe even a part of yourself that's been forgotten, don't let it fade when this video ends. Here on True Life Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. We honor the voices that worked, endured, and kept believing that one day someone would finally listen. Subscribe to True Life Stories, and let's make sure no one's sacrifice ever goes unheard again.